I imagine, even in a group our size, if we were to take a poll, that it would be more than a handful of times throughout our lives, from youth on up into whatever point we have reached, that we have made this sort of statement when presented with an, let's call it, opportunity to do something. Do I have to? Whether it was waking up to go to school at the crack of dawn, if you were like me as a young child, the first one on the bus at 5:30 in the morning. Do I have to? Whether it's waking up every morning again at the crack of dawn to make my way to whatever occupation I may occupy and do for a means of support for my family. Are there not some days where you lie there and think, do I really have to? Unfortunately, there are times, maybe even in an assembly like this, where you may have woken up this morning knowing your destination for the day, knowing that it is the day in which we assemble to worship, and sometimes, based upon many different reasons that may have occurred within our life, within a day or two prior to this moment, that sometimes we might even be tempted to think, do I have to? Do I really need to get up in this moment and go through all that I have to in preparing myself to come to worship? Is today a day when I'm going to do that? When I'm going to endeavor to make the effort? Do I really have to? Sometimes that statement of do I have to comes about in situations that for us may be very negative. Maybe perhaps based upon whatever situation of life you may be in, the aspect or thought rather of going to a family reunion may be something that stirs within our minds this idea of do I have to? There's an interesting statement, and the reason why I brought all of this up this morning is there is an interesting statement in the beginning of this text, which Jim just read for us. Really, if we go back into the context a few moments ago, but starting back in verse 1, as we will this morning, there's an interesting statement made in this context in a very familiar passage to us. This is yet another lesson in the series that I will be doing about once a quarter throughout this year on familiar passages re-examined. Perhaps there is something that we have not paid attention to or has not struck us with as much emphasis perhaps as other things that we may discuss in these familiar passages. Usually when we approach the book of John, especially here within chapter 4, we're dealing with the context surrounding what comes up for us in John 4 and verse 24. That is the context of true worship towards God now in this present time. The time in which God is not held within a man-made place, that they who worship Him will worship Him in spirit and in truth. And those things are legitimate. Those studies are important, and we should understand those things from these passages. But there is so much more of a wealth of information here within this context. Now, there's a statement made in verse 1 here where it says this: Therefore, when Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. So he's making a journey now from the southern portion of Palestine up into the northern portion, his sort of home area, so to speak, at least as far as for the period of his ministry. He is journeying now from the region around Jerusalem up north into the region of Galilee. And there's a interesting statement that is made here. but he needed to go through Samaria in verse 4. In fact, some translations will say it this way. I believe the New American Standard will say it this way. He had to go through Samaria. Now, if you asked this question and surrounded this context or presented this presumption to any Jew of the day in which Jesus lived, as we will see in a moment, because of the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, if you had presented them with this case, I don't even begin to shadow a doubt that one of the first statements that may be made is this idea of, do I have to? Why? Because the Jews in general avoided going through Samaria. That is, taking the path of least resistance. In order to make this journey from the northern portion of Palestine to the south, or vice versa, as in the case of Jesus and his disciples here, from the south unto the north. As I was discussing with the kids in class this morning as we're going through this sort of survey of the ancient world and Bible geography, the only thing that I remember from my studies of geometry growing up in school, the quickest way between 2 points is always what? A straight line. And the same is still the case today. And in this instance, when you are making a journey from Judea unto Galilee, the quickest way to make the trip between these 2 points is directly through the Jordan Valley. It is directly in a straight line from south to north. In fact, that journey could be completed in about a day and a half of walking. But that wasn't the typical route by which the Jews would make this journey. Again, because of the tension that is built up between the Jews and the Samaritans, because of their prejudice, because of their viewpoint of these peoples, who are the descendants of those taken from a captured land by their captors, both the Assyrians and later the Babylonians, these captured peoples from other lands who were placed in this region of Palestine, their promised land, and began to live there during the period of the captivity for some 70 years. You have a generation and a half plus of people who have developed just in that portion before God's people returned from exile, in which they made this their home. Now, over time, there began to be some intermingling between the two, and so you have both the disdain which they have for these foreign people in their land, and also in the instances where these intermarriages did take place, you see the disdain for these who were not fully seen as Jews. In fact, quite honestly, were seen as worse than your average Gentile. But then from the viewpoint of the Samaritan people, as you have a generation and a half plus of people who, at this point, we're looking at even further along than that from the return, know no other home. They do not know necessarily the place of their roots from wherever they may have come, of other conquered lands by which they were conquered. This is their home. And after the return of God's people, they've been somewhat influenced by the culture surrounding them, by the Jewish culture surrounding them. And so there is a mixture of these two in this place. But because of this extreme prejudice that the Jews hold against the Samaritans, they would add a significant amount of time into their journeys, avoiding this portion of land. They would either take the western route along the coastal plain, which takes a day and a half worth of walking and quite literally doubles the time. It would take you about 3.5 days of walking by the way of the coast. roughly that same, if not more, going the eastern route through the Central Range. Why? Because of the topography. If any of you have done any hiking through mountainous areas, what do you know? The change in topography from flat coastal lands to these mountainous regions will do what? Inherently, it will slow you down. So they will extend their time simply out of a motivation not to go through these areas, not to take the path of least resistance. If you were to present this scenario to an average Jew, they would say, do I really have to? But the Bible clearly tells us here that Jesus needed to go through Samaria. Though he would be looked down upon by any Jew for taking this sort of a journey, he needed to go through Samaria. Yes, he had to, so to speak. Why? Because of the greater good that he would do there. So often, perhaps, we avoid certain situations. We avoid certain groups of people. We avoid certain scenarios in which we might find ourselves in taking the gospel to the world because it makes us uncomfortable. Here is a group of people with which the Jews share a great deal of shared history. As we will see in just a moment, where Jesus interacts with this Samaritan woman, and we will focus on the profound nature of that interaction alone in just a moment. Where is it that this instance, this picture into this moment in time, where is it that this takes place? It takes place in the city of Samaria known as Sychar, but specifically where? At Jacob's well. That one that had been built by the Jewish forefather, a direct descendant of their father Abraham, the one for whom they, as the nation of Israel, were named, Jacob himself. Here today, in that moment, if we place ourselves in the shoes of those who are walking around and observing this in the time in which Jesus was there and interacting with this woman, this was a place of daily gathering. This place, with a significant tie to the history of God's people, had a very practical use and tie to the people of Samaria as well. Because as people, what is one of our basest needs? Everyone, regardless of where you are, regardless of what culture you come from, regardless of what country, regardless of what background, everyone needs what in order to survive? Food and water. And daily people are gathering in this place with a deep-rooted connection to the very people who would avoid it like the plague, to gather the most basic need of life, water. Is there a significance to the fact that Jesus will have this incredibly profound spiritual conversation with this woman of Samaria in a place that from a very base standpoint is the place that helps give us vitality and physical life? Absolutely. I believe that that is clearly pointed out with what Jesus uses as an illustration here. He had a need to go through Samaria, despite everything he'd ever heard, despite everything he had ever been taught in his life, fully God and fully man, as he grew up in his own culture. He had a motivation and a need to go to a place where his own brethren would never go. Why? Because there was someone there who would listen. He knew what was about to happen. Being God in flesh, he knew what he was setting out to do in this moment. It was a need. Did he have to? Yes, he had to. Can we learn from that example? Yes, because the need is still there regardless of the place. That people need teaching. People need the truth, and the parameters around those people, their backgrounds, their lives, those things should not matter to us as those carrying forth the message of God. He needed to go to Samaria. And look what comes of this. So he came to the city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. And it was about the 6th hour. Now, what we see in this is that Jesus was fully God and fully human. And as he was fully man, he felt the weariness that comes upon us at times. He felt the drain that can come from doing physical activity. Often we will caveat the reasons why we may have this sort of attitude towards do we have to because of our energy level. Because we feel drained, we feel tired, we feel incapable of doing this for one reason or another. Jesus, who serves as our example, felt those same feelings, felt those same pulls and pushes, those same draining feelings, and had needs just as much as you and I do, but he used that need as an opportunity by which he could carry forth his mission to carry this truth to the woman that we're about to meet. And he has this moment in a time when none of us would deny the need for water, when none of us would deny the need for a respite. About the 6th hour. Now, whether you're following the Jewish clock or the Roman clock, this may vary somewhat, but generally this is the heat of the day, the midday, when the sun is at its highest point, when it is beating down upon one in that part of the world. There is a reason for his weariness, but yet he does not allow that to stop him. Notice verse 7. A woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Again, we are surrounding this entire beautiful conversation with the basic needs of life. Food and water. That which gives us energy and vitality of a physical sense. But Jesus was about to enter this conversation into the spiritual realm, far greater than the physical. Notice the shock in this woman's voice. The woman of Samaria said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Notice, for the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. There was a need, and so therefore Jesus took the journey to fulfill this need, to carry his ministry, to carry his teaching into Samaria, perhaps for this very moment with this woman. But this typical attitude of the Jews, avoiding Samaritans at all costs, was not something only he would be familiar with, but also this Samaritan woman. She knew full well the way things set in the world, the way things were, the way people usually reacted, the way interactions between Jews and Samaritans usually happened. And what was that? They avoided it at all costs. Howbeit that you ask a drink from me, number one, a Samaritan woman, because we have no dealings. The Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. But at times we may encounter people, if we step outside of our comfort zone and go into these places and take up these opportunities to carry the truth, where perhaps our emotions are driving us to say, do I have to? Where we're met with at least some shock or resistance, because they know how few of us may ever enter into these parts of the world, into these situations to care for them. Why? For the Jews, so to speak, had no dealings with the Samaritans. You ever entered into a conversation with a person who has no religious background whatsoever, or even worse, who has a bad taste in their mouth for the Christian because of an experience that they may have had in the past? What do you, a good and godly person, want to have to do with me? In the context of what we're studying, how is that much more different than the reaction this woman had? How is it that you, a Jewish man, want to have anything to do with me, much less ask me for something, ask me for this drink? But Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, says the perfect thing for that very moment. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it was who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. The conversation is now shifting. It's not so much about the necessity of life, is it? It's not so much about the water and the food which his disciples have gone into the city to get. Now he is turning the conversation to the spiritual. So easily, Jesus will take something that is so basic in the life of man and turn it to what is most important. For you and I, we can easily take from this example the need to do that. The need to look for opportunities in which we can take things that are easily understandable to all mankind and turn them into spiritual conversations. If you understood, understanding is so important, and yet so many are languishing, to use an old-fashioned word, are languishing in a world where understanding is few and far between. Even with this woman, it's going to take a significant amount of effort. Even from this one statement which begins the conversation, there's quite a bit of explaining which must be done. There's quite a bit of discussing which must be done, because her reaction is not one of immediately understanding what he means. Rather, that conversation is initially met with resistance based upon their understanding, based upon her understanding. Sometimes that will happen to us. We may try to turn a conversation to the spiritual, and yet because of the way that their mindset is positioned in that moment, we may be met with certain forms of resistance based upon wanting to see more, wanting to understand more, needing more evidences. Again, with this woman still focused on the physical in this moment, she says to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water?" That word living water could be easily translated as well as running water, such as that which runs through a stream or through a river. How are you going to get living water from this well which stands still? Not only does it stand still, but it is deep, meaning you need the proper tools, you need the proper things to draw this. Looking at it from a completely different mindset. Again, still not positioned for this conversation. She meets him with resistance. How are you going to do this? Some questions are asked in resistance, but with patience and understanding, we can further explain that which is what we're actually driving to get at. Notice, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well to drink from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Again, a shared piece of connection in one way or form that these two diametrically opposed people have, and she leans into what she understands in that moment while she is still yet confused. So Jesus, again, works, puts the effort forth to change her mind from the physical to that which is spiritual. Jesus answered and said unto her, whoever drinks of this water, focusing on the physical, will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him. Notice, now he is putting it in the first person. Now he is applying it to himself. It is not the one who asks of you this drink. It is I. It is me. He who drinks of this water which I will give him will never thirst. But the water which I give him will become in him a fountain of waters, springing up into everlasting life. I love that envisioning, where we're speaking of living water, that water which is moving and runs, but this water is even more than that which we may be able to physically understand in this context. When it is received spiritually by the one who will drink of this living water, it will spring forth out of him like fountains of water, like fountains of this living water unto everlasting life. Wait a minute now. We're talking about something completely different than the physical. But still, there is this desire to have this completion. There is this desire to never thirst again that is wholly wrapped up in her response to the physical. Notice, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. Again, this well that serves as a conduit between the cultures of those people in this moment is an everyday thing for them. They would make the journey from the city out into this outer area, and they would draw water. Why? Because it is a necessity of life. She hears this and not fully understanding what she's hearing, still focused upon that physical. She says, give it to me. She says, I wish for this living water that I may never thirst again and never have to get up and do the hard work of drawing. Sometimes we may get a knee-jerk reaction in discussing with people, don't we? They begin to understand things a little bit clearer, but maybe their motivation isn't necessarily out of a love or devotion for the one whom we are presenting to them, but rather it is because of a fear for their own life, whether physically or more importantly in this moment spiritually, where they're saying, I want this, I desire this up until this point. But they're again motivated by the physical and not the spiritual in that moment. Jesus said to her, go and call the husband and come here. Here's where the conversation really shifts. Because he knows something about her that no one else would. Notice, the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. A light bulb moment. Wait a minute, this isn't any normal encounter. This is not some man with a magic gadget that's going to make it possible for me to receive this living water where I'm never going to have to come here and draw again. He knows something about me no one else can. How does he know my current living situation? This is no mere mortal. This is no mere man. Notice, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. And so understanding now, wait a minute, this conversation is shifting to the spiritual. What does she do? She asks him a question completely off of the subject of what he is going at that moment. And at times in our religious conversations with others, when they finally realize that we are trying to turn the conversation to the spiritual, what so often happens? We use it as an opportunity to sort of play Bible trivia, don't we? Or perhaps ask every question which may have occurred in our minds in the deep musings of our life. Whether that's within the shower or wherever it may be that you do your deepest thinking, sometimes we can come up with some doozies of questions. And she does, in this moment, come up with a question that is on her mind. Now, are those things not necessarily legitimate? In some cases, they might not be. But simply, this woman is using what knowledge she has, as mixed as it may be, religiously, to try to include herself in this conversation and ask this question. I perceive she understands, at least to a degree, that he is a prophet. And so she asks this question. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you, Jews, say that Jerusalem is the place where you ought to worship. What's the answer? Jesus, in again his infinite wisdom, brings her back around to the subject of what he is dealing with. The spiritual in that moment, rather than this physically dominated question, where's the place of worship? The place of worship is about to no longer matter. As far as the physical nature of it, Jesus said unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. You don't have a full understanding. And we know what we worship for salvation is of the Jews. In that moment, it was. But the hour is coming, and now is. Notice, now he's taking that which is the future, and he's bringing it into the here and now. The hour is coming, and now is. Notice, I love that. Now is when the true worshipers, not those that are simply going by what they understand previously, what they have been taught up until this point, things are changing. Now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is, notice, seeking such to worship him. Why go to Samaria? Why was that need? Why was that motivation there? Because here is a soul that would hear and listen with effort placed into her in this moment. The Father is seeking such to worship him. Jesus is having this encounter with this woman for a reason. For God is spirit. And those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Notice, the woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming. That influence of the Jews around her, she had some sort of understanding of the Messiah, the one who is coming to deliver, who is also called Christ, the deliverer, is coming. And when he comes, he will tell us all things. Jesus comes down to the very meat of the matter. There comes a time in these spiritual conversations when we must eventually come down to the meat of the matter. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am. The translators add he, but I think it's quite profound, the fact that the one who said, tell them I am sent you from the burning bush, says to this woman, I who speak to you am. Meaning that I am here, I have always been, I will always be. The eternality of God is placed before her in that moment. And I love this little picture here as we begin to get to the close of our lesson, because those disciples, who again had been sent out on a mission for the physical needs of Jesus, return, and their minds again still set into the worldly things, return to the scene, and what are they? But marveled that he talked to a woman. And yet, no one said anything to her. They're not asking, what are you seeking? What are you after? Why is Jesus talking to her? They just sit and watch. And based upon what she has just heard, that the Messiah is standing right before her, notice, she left her water pot, that which is so crucial to the life of her physical body, and went running into the city. She made her way into the city and said to the men, "Come and see a man who told me all things I ever did. Could this be the Christ?" He said he was. And she's beginning to believe it. And they went out to the city and came to him. Upon that message that Jesus delivered to a woman that most of his brethren would have avoided at all cost, because he had to, because he needed to go through Samaria. Through this, many others are brought to an opportunity to hear the truth. It's so important for us to understand the need that there is to go to all mankind, no matter what background, no matter what may hinder us in many other ways, where we will ask those questions from time to time. Do I have to? And the answer is, based upon the example of Jesus, yes. Why? Because there is a need there. And the truth is available for all men. It is the power of God, Paul would tell us later in the book of Romans, unto salvation, to all men, both Jew and Greek. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you have an opportunity to present the living water that is Christ to those around you who may not be what we would think is the prime candidates for such, if that thought of do I have to, is there a need there ever enters your mind, remember that yes, there is. And we can rest assured that we do not know what manner of good may come from even that chance incident. Perhaps you're here this morning and have yet to obey the gospel of Christ. You've yet to partake of that living water which exists within Christ alone, that salvation which is available to all mankind. Won't you do that while you have the opportunity? Putting on Christ in baptism, having repented of your sins and confessing your belief in Christ. But maybe like most of us, you've done that, yet you find yourself in situations where our mandate to be those whom God would have us to be faithful servants, has lost importance in your life. Perhaps the influence of the world and other things around you has influenced you to drift farther and farther from what you know to be most important, where you find yourself living a life that is more in harmony with the life you lived as the old man outside of Christ. God has not given up on you in moments where you may have even given up on God. If you will simply submit to his will, ask his forgiveness, confess that sin, he's faithful and just to forgive you of those sins, and that blood which Christ shed for all of us will cleanse you from that unrighteousness. You will then be placed again upon the pathway of righteousness. And as we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship and know how important it is with him and he with us. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation this morning, for any reason, won't you come as we stand and sing this song to encourage you?